The Standing Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Trade is called to order. We are meeting today to continue our examination of Bill C-85, an act to amend the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement Implementation Act and to make related amendments to other acts. Before I turn to our witnesses, I will ask senators to introduce themselves. I will start on my right.
Stephen Green, Nova Scotia.
Leo Husakos, Quebec.
Paul Mascot, Quebec.
Mary Coyle, Nova Scotia.
Patricia Bovey, Manitoba.
Tony Dean, Ontario.
Peter Beam, Ontario.
And I'm Rainelle Landrychuk from Saskatchewan. Welcome to the committee. We have before us Mr. Alex Neve, Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada, who is quite a recent he comes often to our committee, is what I'm trying to say. So we welcome you back again. You understand our process, and we appreciate your input on many bills and subject matters that we have here. Accompanying Mr. Neve today is Mr. Michael Lynk, Associate Professor of the Faculty of Law, Western University. Welcome. And Miss Sara AvMatt from the Canadian Friends Service Committee of Quakers. Welcome to the committee. The floor is yours. I presume you've figured out how you're going to proceed in your allotted time. So it's Mr. Lynk that is going to start. Thank you.
To the Honourable Senator Andreychuk and to all of the honourable members of the committee, thank you for your invitation to the three of us to be able to appear before the committee to give our views with respect to Bill C-85. As the chair mentioned, my name is Michael Lynk. I'm an associate professor of law at Western University in London, Ontario. And since May of 2016, I have served as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967. Just as an aside before we go on, this is the first time I visited this historic building, and I should tell you, each fall I spend several weeks in my constitutional law class, informing and educating first-year law students on constitutional law, particularly with respect to the creation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the role that this particular building played in those complex negotiations. I also want to acknowledge several other organizations, some of whom are here today as observers, who are in support with respect to our views on Bill C-85, and these organizations include the United Church of Canada, the Mennonite Central Committee, Independent Jewish Voices, and Kairos. From our respective vantage point, Bill C-85, the Canada-Israel Free Trade Implementation Act, has a number of commendable features, and these include chapters in the agreement on gender, on corporate responsibility, labor rights, and on environmental protection. However, we have two very serious concerns with this legislation. First, the revised CIFTA provides no human rights provision which would commit both parties to upholding all contemporary standards of human rights and humanitarian law. This is particularly pertinent given the long-standing record of systemic human rights violations during Israel's almost 52-year-old occupation of the Palestinian territory. Canada is no stranger to negotiating human rights provisions in its free trade agreements. Indeed, Canada's 2008 free trade agreement with Colombia contains just such an admirable human rights provision. As well, the 2000 association agreement between the European Union and Israel contains a human rights agreement, which the EU uses to monitor the deteriorating human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. And our second concern goes to the present language of the revised CIFTA, which continues to extend all of the benefits of the free trade agreement to the illegally annexed East Jerusalem and to the 240 or so illegal Israeli settlements and the industrial parks, the farms, and the other enterprises in the occupied West Bank. Allowing the benefits of the agreement to extend to the settlements is contrary, first of all, to international law, second of all, to Canadian law, thirdly, to stated Canadian foreign policy, and fourthly, to the recent directions of all UN members set forth by the UN Security Council and the UN Human Rights Council to distinguish between Israel and its occupation of the Palestinian territory. How can Canada say that it regards the Israeli settlements as illegal under international law, which it does? And how can Canada say that it believes in a rules-based international order, which it does, and yet sign a new free trade agreement with Israel, which extends all of the benefits of the agreement to the Israeli settlements, which are at the heart of the human rights violations in the occupied territory? To rectify this, all Canada would have to say is that the CIFTA only applies to Israel's recognized pre-1967 international borders, which would put us on the right side of international law and Canadian law. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to be before you, Senators. I'd like to begin by noting what a humbling honor it is to be sharing these concerns, these human rights concerns with you as we gather in unceded Algonquin territory. I'm not before you today because Amnesty International has a position in favor of or in opposition to Canada having a free trade agreement with Israel, just as we take no position on Canada entering into a free trade deal with any country. I am here because we do insist that Canada's trading relationship with any country, including Israel, be that through a bilateral deal, a multilateral arrangement, or any other agreement, be entirely consistent with our international legal obligations, particularly those laid out in international human rights law and international humanitarian law. That is why Amnesty has repeatedly for many years urged the Canadian government to adopt a policy ensuring that all trade deals with any country will be subject to an independent, comprehensive human rights impact assessment before the agreement is concluded and at occasional regular intervals thereafter. However, other than a deeply flawed and inadequate human rights review process attached to the Canada-Colombia Free Trade Agreement, no such human rights assessments are carried out, and no such assessments have been carried out with respect to the Canada-Israel Agreement. If such an assessment were to be conducted, it would readily illustrate a very serious human rights problem with this agreement, namely that extending the scope of the deal to trade originating in illegal Israeli settlements within the occupied Palestinian territory amounts to benefiting from and facilitating violations of both international humanitarian law and international human rights law. That is why Amnesty International urgently calls on this committee to amend Bill C-85 such that it does not apply to any goods or services that are produced in whole or in part in the unlawful Israeli settlements, industrial parks, farms, or other enterprises located in the OPT. As you have heard from Special Rapporteur Lynk, the core concern is that Israeli settlements in the OPT are illegal under international humanitarian law, namely the provisions of the Fourth Geneva Convention, forbidding an occupying power from transferring its own population into territory that it occupies. Israel's policy of doing so expansively over the course of nearly 52 years of occupation amounts to war crimes. The Canadian government itself recognizes that those Israeli settlements in the OPT are unlawful. But it's not just a legal question. The human rights impact of more than a half century of illegal settlements has been devastating, documented over and over in numerous Amnesty International reports. That has included the forcible displacement and transfer of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian civilians from their homes and lands, the demolition of over 50,000 Palestinian homes and structures, and the appropriation of at least 100,000 hectares of Palestinian land for settlement use. Palestinians face massive restrictions on their freedom of movement, including as a result of settler-only roads that divide their towns and villages. They are further subject to restricted access to and use of natural resources such as water, fertile land, stone quarries, and minerals. All of that has resulted in extensive violations of a range of essential rights, including rights to an adequate standard of living, work, housing, health, and education. Illegal settlements are set up and maintained in a wider context whereby Israeli forces have imposed various forms of collective punishment on the Palestinian population, and grave human rights abuses associated with the hundreds of military checkpoints throughout the OPT have become commonplace. Amnesty International reports and urgent actions are replete as well with accounts of death and injuries of Palestinian civilians in the OPT, with little accountability by the Israeli military and police, and the regular detention of Palestinian children, all of which occurs against this backdrop of occupation and illegal settlements. Senators, Amnesty International takes the step of calling for trade, investment, or economic sanctions or boycotts in our human rights work only in rare and exceptional circumstances. We have done so in this situation. In 2017, as the Palestinian people marked 50 years of war crimes and human rights violations associated with the occupation, we took the very serious step of saying that it was time to ban the import of all goods and services produced in the illegal Israeli settlements, noting that this had become an essential means for putting an end to multi-million-dollar profits that have fueled the expansion of the settlements and allowed grave human rights violations for decades. All governments, including Canada, have a clear international obligation to ensure respect for international humanitarian and human rights law. They must take measures to ensure that they do not assist in any manner the continuation of breaches of international law that are inherent to illegal settlements. In fact, governments, including Canada, should be using all possible influence and means open to them to stop such violations. That is why Amnesty International has called on the government to impose a ban on imports. That has not happened. At a minimum, however, it is certainly incumbent upon the Canadian government to ensure that these illegal settlements do not in any way benefit from the beneficial provisions of this free trade agreement. That is why the two amendments that we have proposed are so essential. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your attention and for offering me this opportunity to speak. I never expected to find myself speaking in the Senate, but I do believe there are many other ordinary Canadians like me who believe that when international trade is being considered, human rights must also be considered. In the fall of 2010, I participated in the World Council of Churches Ecumenical Accompaniment Program in Palestine and Israel, and saw for myself how the settlements, which are illegal under international law, are a source of human rights violations and an impediment to peace. I would like to share one example. Our team heard that demolitions were taking place. One of the villages involved was Jiflik in the Jordan Valley. Jiflik is a herding community located between a main road and a parallel road that serves a settlement. On the day that I visited with other accompaniment team members, we were told that soldiers had arrived at 6 a.m. the day before and bulldozed 2 of the people's homes and 3 livestock shelters. I saw dead baby goats half buried in the rubble. The soldiers had refused to give the people enough time to get the animals out. The village had received demolition notices about 2 years previously and had entered into a process in Israeli civil court to appeal them. The case was ongoing and the court had ordered a stay on the demolitions. The people attempted to show their court documents with the stay of demolition to the soldier in command, but he refused to look at them and ordered the bulldozers to go ahead. When the bulldozer was finished, he turned to the village representative and said, "Now you can have your court process." The most likely reason for the demolitions in Jiflik? The settlement had recently expanded their vineyards across the road and planted grapevines on village land next to the animal shelters. Perhaps the irony will not be lost on you when I remind you that there is currently a case in Canadian courts regarding wine from the Jordan Valley settlements, which is being sold in Canada under the label Product of Israel. I wish I could tell you that this is an isolated incident, but sadly that is far from the case. If time permitted, I could give you more examples. But I will close by sincerely asking you to recommend that Bill C-85 not go forward without including human rights and excluding goods produced in the settlements.
Thank you. That's the presentation on behalf of your group, I may say. Thank you. I will turn to Senator Massacoff for the first questions.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, all three of you, for being with us today. I think your message is clear, and I think it's understood, and I think we pretty good understanding of why you have that opinion, because it's logical and generic to the world opinion in many respects. Yesterday, we asked the same question. In fact, that we asked the minister to respond to say why were we treating the issue differently than, say, the European situation. I hope you got a copy of the transcript, or are you aware? Could I get your response to how the minister explained their action and their reasoning, and what's your thoughts on that?
My understanding is that the essence of the position of Minister Carr and of Global Affairs is that the free trade agreement included a recognition of a customs union that had been signed in 1994 through the Paris Protocol between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization. And that customs union, argues Israel and Canada, allows the expansive borders of Israel to include the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and including the Israeli settlements. I think that's a mistaken interpretation of the customs union. If we go back and look at the Paris Protocol Customs Union of 1994, the purpose of that signing between Israel and the PLO was to extend benefits to allow the Palestinian economy to grow, with the hope that it would wind up being the economic base of a sovereign Palestinian state. If you look at the Paris Protocol, there is only one mention of settlements, and that mention only goes to the fact that Israel agrees that it would deduct income taxes from Palestinians working on the settlements and remit that money to the Palestinian Authority. There is no other basis in the customs union of the Paris Protocol to say that the benefits of the customs union were meant to extend to Israeli settlements, or to allow Israel to expand the definition of its borders or the scope of its sovereignty to include settlements in any free trade agreement. So I think the premise of the free trade agreement, I think the premise of Minister Carr is mistaken on that basis. And that is further enforced by the fact, by what I think what all three of us said, is that the settlements are illegal under international law. They're illegal under Canadian law, under the Geneva Conventions Act of 1957, under the War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity Act of 2000. They're against Canadian policy, and they're against the recent directions by the United Nations Security Council and the United Nations Human Rights Council. If I can just cite them to you, because I think these are important for us to understand. In December 2016, the United Nations Security Council adopted by a vote of 14 in favor and 1 abstention, the United States, Resolution 2334. And it says in paragraph 5, it calls upon all states, bearing in mind paragraph 1 of this resolution, which goes to the illegality of the Israeli settlements, quote, to distinguish in their relevant dealings between the territory of the State of Israel and the territories occupied since 1967. And in 2018, the United Nations General Assembly adopted Resolution 7398, which calls upon, and here I'm quoting, all states and international organizations to continue to actively pursue policies which ensure respect for their obligations under international law with regard to all illegal Israeli practices and measures in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, particularly Israeli settlement activities. So it's very hard for me to square, I think it's very hard for all of us here to square Canadian policy defending the use of the customs union to extend the benefits of our free trade agreement to the Israeli settlements in the light of not only the laws that I've mentioned, but international diplomatic policy.
Help me out a little bit. I mean, we had the minister is sincere in his response. We've had multiple governments adopt a similar position, the multiple ministers. I have to suspect our bureaucrats are pretty sharp in Canada, and I have to suspect they understand and they're aware of your argument and what the references you make. So why is it in spite of all that, which is pretty common, why is it that Canada, multiple governments for many, many years have taken a different approach for probably what they think is the right decision for Canada? But help me out there.
Well, obviously, I think that's a profoundly important question, Senator, and the answer to it is beyond our capabilities. I think we would say that it is reflective more widely of many ways in which there have often been contradictions in Canadian policy with respect to Israel-Palestine, where, as Professor Lynk has highlighted, we have clear Canadian recognition that the settlements are illegal, for instance, but in a whole host of other ways, failure to strongly support resolutions and decisions, sometimes within various aspects of the UN system. An example here of a failure in our trade policy to ensure that there's coherence between recognizing that illegality and then putting in place the concrete measures that will give it force and effect. There clearly are others who press the Canadian government to adopt policies such as what lies behind the free trade agreement. And sadly, this is not exceptional. There are far too many times when a clear commitment to what international law unequivocally requires is given sort of second-class standing, I guess, over other political and economic considerations. And we're here to urge that no longer continue.
If I can quickly add to Mr. Neve's answer, law has changed, and understanding of how business and human rights interact has changed profoundly over the last 10 years, largely led by the United Nations and its new policies on business and human rights. This has created, I think, a whole new ethos in considering how to use, if you like, human rights audits of business transactions, and particularly free trade agreements. So I think in the last decade, I think we would have seen a heightened awareness of the fact that laws with respect to, in our case, the illegal Israeli settlements and the adverse role they play in bringing peace to the Middle East and ensuring Palestinian self-determination are playing, in fact, a detrimental role. So that's why I think we've seen more emphasis by human rights groups and more awareness by governments with respect to this. Certainly in my travels in Europe and my role as Special Rapporteur, I speak often to governments there. And they have a much, I think, richer appreciation of the relationship between the Israeli settlements and the detriments to Palestinian self-determination and the detriments to Palestinian human rights. And they are much more advanced than Canada is with respect to trying to ensure that their policies towards Israel and the occupied territory are in line with modern international law. We are, I regret to say, among the laggards when it comes to this.
Thank you, Chair.
Could I just follow up? We've talked about the Paris Protocol, and my kind analyst here has refreshed my memory that Israel and PLO signed the protocol and I think put it in effect September 1995. Canada then went in 1999, and we heard this testimony earlier from the department officials, not from the minister per se, but that there was a joint Canadian-Palestinian framework on economic cooperation and trade with the Palestinian Liberation Organization on behalf of the Palestinian Authority. According to the agreement, it confirms the application of preferential tariffs and any future concessions under CIFTA to goods produced in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. I don't have time to get the rest of the testimony that we heard from the officials. that I understand is in place, and that the preferential tariffs for the Palestinian authorities will continue. The minister yesterday wasn't asked particularly about that agreement, but he said when he was touring, he was certainly brought from the Palestinian people the issues that you've even raised here and the department raised previously, but that no one objected to the free trade agreement being modernized. So I'm wondering what weight you put on this framework and the preferential tariffs. Does that factor into your submission? Does that change it, or you don't think it has much effect?
The framework agreement that was signed between the PLO and Canada back in 1999 was designed to improve the bilateral trade relationships between Canada and Palestine. I must admit, I think it's a very, very small trading relationship that winds up occurring. The Palestinians have a very small, very dependent economy. 80% of their trade is with Israel, and there's a huge trade deficit they have with Israel. So it's a very, very small amount of goods that wind up coming into Canada. Whatever benefits Palestinians receive from that framework agreement, I think is more than negated by the fact that we trade and allow the benefits of our free trade agreement to go to the Israeli settlements, which are exceptionally detrimental to the Palestinian economy. They wind up distorting the economy. The Israeli settlements occupy an area of 60% of the West Bank, which means that the Palestinians are confined to an area of about 165 little islands of disconnected territory in the West Bank in the so-called areas A and B. And it's extremely hard to have freedom of movement of people and extremely hard to have freedom of movement of goods. And as James Wolfenson, the former executive director of the World Bank, said when he was the quartet representative in the late 1990s in the Middle East, he said, without freedom of movement of goods, there is no economy. And that is an apt description, I think, of what occurs with the Palestinians.
So what you're saying is that we should have canceled that agreement and put in place a different framework for the PLO.
No, I'm sorry if I've been confusing to you. I think that agreement is good. It needs to be built upon. But I think what I'm saying is no modern, liberal, progressive free trade agreement between Canada and the Palestinians, be it the PLO or the Palestinian National Authority, will do much to revive the Palestinian economy unless and until the occupation is ended, the settlements are removed in their entirety, and Palestine has its own land base and its own economic base to be able to thrive and to grow and to create productive relationships with the rest of the world. Any agreement we have with the Palestinians with respect to trade is going to have minuscule effect on the Palestinians and their state-building aspirations until the occupation is ended.
Mr. Neve?
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar, that none of us, I think, are urging that the agreement with the PLO needs to be cancelled, and I would echo Special Rapporteur Lynk's suggestion that perhaps there's ways in which it too could be improved and strengthened. But the existence of that agreement does not in any way diminish from or negate our very serious concerns about BillC85.
And if I can, just add one last point with respect to something you mentioned that Minister Carr had spoken to yesterday. I believe he said, and I did look quickly through the testimony from yesterday, that he said this issue was never raised to him by any of the Palestinians that he wound up meeting in his visits to the area. I am in regular contact with both Israeli and Palestinian NGOs and human rights defenders whose emphasis and focus is on the occupation and trying to end it. And it would be, I would think, the unanimous view of all of these Israeli and Palestinian human rights groups that any encouragement given to the continued growth and expansion of the settlements through an economic agreement like CIFTA is detrimental to finding a genuine two-state solution and peace in the Middle East. I'm not sure who Minister Carr met, but I'm sure if he had met with some of these Palestinian and Israeli human rights groups, they would have informed him very strongly of their position with respect to the Israeli settlements and the absolute, I suppose their view, there should be an absolute prohibition on trade with them.
I think he said that many issues were raised with him on all of the issues of concern that you've placed on the table. And I don't think we needed to go further on that. The question what that was put to him, and I think it was Senator Massicott, you put it to him, I may be wrong, that was the free trade agreement and the fact that we were signing it as we are now brought to him in any form. And he said, no, it had not. Many other issues, critical issues, particularly like human rights issues, settlements issues, were brought to his attention. That's what I got out of his testimony for what it's worth. It's what I understood him to say, that no one, not officials or others, but certainly he did hear about the other issues that you've put on the table. So,
If I could just add one final point on this particular issue. I referred to the fact in my testimony that it is very exceptional for Amnesty to have taken a position with any country calling for a ban on imports in the ways we have. And there's a number of criteria that we apply before we make that decision, one of which is to assure ourselves that there is wide support for that position at the grassroots, from local human rights organizations, etc. So that's not with respect to Bill C-85 particular, but that's actually with respect to a much more serious move of calling for all trade from the illegal settlements to any country to be banned and prohibited. And there we have sensed nothing but widespread support.
Mr. Neve, you and I have wrestled human rights issues for decades. I should say that about myself, not you. You look much younger and more fit than I do. I want to be sure that I understand your position. You wanted the human rights aspects into the agreement, whether it is about settlements or other issues that have been documented. If Bill C-85 doesn't go forward, then we would be what? In a position of continuing the existing agreement, or canceling the framework agreement. So what is your position should the bill pass? We know your position that you don't wish it to go. But should it not pass, are you suggesting that the existing free trade agreement continue? Are you existing that the continuing, I've heard Mr. Lynk say we would continue the framework agreement, that it could be there and it could be built on. But Mr. Neve, is your position that you cancel the framework agreement and the existing agreement, or are your comments only to the new 85, if I'm making myself clear? Because those are the conundrums I think the government quite rightly struggles with, and I think we as parliamentarians struggle with.
So I'll only speak for Amnesty International, cognizant that others may have slightly different responses to the very legitimate conundrum, as you've described it, that you've framed. And just to be clear, Amnesty is not saying that C-85 should be defeated. We're urging that it be amended. Amended to take account of these two specific recommendations. One, that there be a strong human rights provision introduced into the legislation. And secondly, that there be an amendment to make it clear that Canada is not going to apply CIFTA to goods or services originating from illegal settlements. That's what we're looking for here. Yes, we recognize that will pose a dilemma for the government, and it may even require going back to the Israeli government and renewing some round of the negotiations. And that may mean that the process of finalizing CIFTA itself is not as rapid as all would like. we would say that when such serious human rights considerations and breaches of humanitarian law are on the table, then if it's going to take longer, if it's going to become more complicated, so be it.
I see no other questioners. I think Senator Massicott and I have taken the essence of the questions that we needed to put to you, and I think you came well prepared to make your case known. So on behalf of the committee, I thank you for coming forward, raising this very serious issues of human rights and the dilemma of the settlements and your perspectives on Bill C85. And I'm glad, Mr. Neve, that you clarified you're not against the agreement per se. You want it amended to add to it. So I appreciate that clarification. That's helpful. So on behalf of the committee, I thank you all three. I hope your first experience, Ms. AvMatt, was not too onerous on you, and that you had a chance to come forward, as has been pointed out, a historic building that has just started to operate. We trust you'll come back, because I have followed the Quaker movement for many, many years in the human rights, and you were always there on so many issues, and we appreciate that. And we appreciate the expertise of Mr. Lynk. And as always, Mr. Neve, thank you for bringing Amnesty's perspectives to our table. It is one we take very seriously. The committee will now adjourn to go in camera on our, suspend. I shouldn't. Yes, we're suspending to go in camera.